The autumn of 1887 fell across the New Mexico territory not like a blanket, but like a fall of fine, sharp dust. It scoured the silver-green hides of the sagebrush that clung stubbornly to the arid soil, and it carried a mournful tune through the cracked bell of the small adobe church in Sagebrush Hollow. The sound was thin and lonely, a whisper of piety in a land that answered more often to the crack of a rifle than the call to prayer. Inside the rattling stagecoach, Mara Linden sat hunched against the relentless shuddering of the wheels. She was a woman made of quiet resilience, her form slight but her spine straight. Even when folded into the cramped space, her dress, a calico of faded blue, was a testament to her skill with a needle, the patches on the elbows and hem sewn with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Her hands, calloused from work but clean, rested on a canvas bag that had seen too many miles. Tucked inside her palm, shielded from the grit that found its way through every crack in the coach, was a letter. The paper was soft and worn, folded and refolded along creases that had become as familiar to her as the lines on her own hand. It was a promise of peace, a word she had almost forgotten the shape of. The handwriting was stark and masculine, the letters formed with a heavy, deliberate pressure. It came from a man named Calder Boone, of a place called Mesquite Gate Ranch. "My wife has passed," the letter stated, the words unadorned by sentiment. "My daughter is 3. I need a woman to help raise her, to teach her. This place is safe." That last word was what she clung to. Safe. It was a harbor in the storm of a life that had offered her little shelter. It was the reason she had spent her last dollars on this one-way ticket into the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory. She had imagined Mesquite Gate Ranch as a sanctuary, a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness. She envisioned a neat, whitewashed fence, a welcoming porch, and perhaps the shy smile of a man weary with grief but decent in his heart. The coach lurched to a final, jarring halt. The driver, a leathery man whose only conversation for 3 days had been a series of grunts, called out, "End of the line. This is it." Mara peered through the dusty window, her heart sinking with the slow, heavy weight of disappointment. There was no whitewashed fence. There was only a crooked line of posts strung with sagging wire. Beyond it, set against a vast and chillingly empty sky, stood a low-slung log house, its timbers darkened by sun and time. Beside it, a barn that might once have been red was now a patchwork of faded paint and weathered gray wood, its roof bowing slightly in the middle like the back of an old man. There was no one waiting. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the jingle of the tired horses' harnesses. The driver hauled her small bag down from the roof and dropped it in the dust without a word. The stagecoach creaked and groaned as it turned, and then it was gone, leaving Mara alone in a cloud of its departure. The lonely church bell of Sagebrush Hollow, her only farewell. She stood for a long moment, the letter a useless talisman in her hand. This was not the sanctuary she had pictured. This was an outpost, a place of profound isolation. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Perhaps she had made a terrible mistake. Taking a breath that tasted of dust and dry grass, she pushed through the gate, its hinges complaining with a rusty squeal, and walked toward the silent house. Before she could reach the porch, the wide door of the barn slid open. A man emerged, stepping from the shadows into the pale afternoon light. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out a significant portion of the doorway. The sleeves of his chambray shirt were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His face was obscured by the wide brim of a sweat-stained hat, his eyes lost in the shadow it cast. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet confidence that spoke of hard work and solitude. As he drew closer, she saw the details, the dark stubble on his jaw, the straight line of his mouth, and a thin, silvery scar that ran across his throat, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. It gleamed faintly in the sun, a stark white line against his tanned skin. This had to be Calder Boone. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadowed gaze taking in her patched dress, her worn bag, her tired face. He didn't speak, just waited. "Mr. Boone Mara's voice was softer than she'd intended, nearly snatched away by the wind. "I'm Mara Linden. I came in response to your letter." He gave no sign of recognition. His expression, what she could see of it, remained unchanged. Slowly, he raised a hand and touched the center of his chest, then gave his head a short, decisive shake. His fingers then went to the scar on his throat, tracing it lightly before making a sharp, cutting motion across the line of it. The gesture was stark and brutal, an unmistakable pantomime of a voice being severed. He couldn't speak. A cold dread washed over Mara. The man who had written of his need for someone to teach his daughter was mute. The neat, strong handwriting on the page in her hand seemed like a phantom, a lie. How could he have written the letter? Before the question could fully form, before the panic could take root, the door of the log house creaked open. A small child, no older than 3, toddled onto the porch. She was a tiny thing, with a halo of messy brown hair and wide, curious eyes the color of dark honey. She wore a simple smock over bare feet, and she looked from the silent man to the strange woman standing in her yard. Her gaze settled on Mara. A moment of solemn contemplation passed, and then a single, hopeful word escaped her lips, a whisper soft as milkweed fluff. "Mama!" The sound pierced Mara's heart with an almost physical pain. It was the sound of a child's deepest longing, an innocent arrow that flew straight to the most vulnerable part of her. But the moment was shattered by a sound from the low ridge that bordered the property. It was laughter, not cheerful or warm, but a coarse, braying sound, full of malice. Mara looked up to see 5 young men on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. They were lounging in their saddles with the insolent ease of those who have never known a hard day's work or a moment of doubt. "Well, look what the stage brought in," one of them yelled, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "Calder's got himself his mail-order bride." Another chimed in, his laughter even louder. "She's a pretty one. Mute, man. Did you have to write sweet nothings to get her all the way out here?" The others hooted and jeered. "The cat got your tongue. Boone, or did someone else get it for you?" The blood drained from Mara's face, then rushed back in a hot, shameful wave. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The letter, the strong, clear handwriting, the mute man who could not have written it. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a prank, a piece of casual cruelty devised by bored, privileged boys with nothing better to do than mock a man's grief and a woman's hope. They had used her desperation as a prop in their vicious little play. Humiliation burned in her chest, so hot and sharp it felt like swallowing glass. She had been made a fool, a public spectacle. Her small, carefully guarded dream of a safe harbor had been torn apart and trampled in the dust for the amusement of these smirking youths. Her first instinct was to run, to turn and flee back down the path, to disappear into the vastness of the plains and never look back. She turned, her body moving before her mind had fully caught up, her hand tightening on the handle of her bag. She would not stay here and endure their scorn. But as she took a step, Calder Boone moved. He reached into a pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small slate and a nub of chalk. With quick, angry strokes, his handwriting rough and jagged in his haste, he scrawled a few words. He held it out for her to see. "I did not write the letter, but if you have nowhere else stay and help, it is safe." His eyes, still shadowed by the brim of his hat, met hers for a fleeting second. In their depths, she saw not pity, but a shared humiliation, a flicker of fury at the injustice of it all. He understood. He was a target of their cruelty. 2. The letter had not just been a lie told to her. It had been a mockery aimed at him. And yet, in the face of it, he was offering her the very thing the false letter had promised: safety. Her resolve wavered. The laughter from the ridge faded into the background. As she stood hesitating, a tiny hand tugged at the sleeve of her dress. She looked down into the upturned face of the little girl. Wren. The child's honey-colored eyes were wide and pleading. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell stories." The simple request undid Mara completely. It wasn't a plea for a mother or a housekeeper. It was a child's wish for a story, for a small bit of magic in a hard and silent world. Looking from the child's innocent face to the man's stark and honest offer, something inside her shifted. The shame was still there, but beneath it, a tiny seed of defiance began to sprout. To leave now would be to give those cruel boys their victory. To stay would be an act of rebellion. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a small breath of a sound, a whispered, "All right." A sigh of relief seemed to pass through Calder Boone. He didn't smile, but the rigid set of his shoulders eased. The men on the ridge, seeing their sport, had soured, let out a few more half-hearted jeers before turning their horses and riding away, their laughter finally swallowed by the immense, quiet landscape. Silence descended once more upon Mesquite Gate Ranch. It was a different silence now, no longer empty, but filled with the weight of a decision made, without a word. Calder shrugged out of his canvas work coat. It was worn and frayed at the cuffs, but it looked sturdy and warm. He stepped forward and gently draped it over Mara's shoulders. The garment settled around her, heavy and comforting. It carried the scent of wood smoke, leather, and the clean, earthy smell of the man himself. The warmth of it seeped through her thin dress, a tangible kindness that spoke more eloquently than words ever could. In the midst of the cold wind, under the vast and unforgiving sky, it felt like the first true welcome she had received. In the quiet space between a mute man, a hopeful child, and a woman with nowhere else to go, a fragile, tender thing had begun. The day at Mesquite Gate Ranch began before the sun. It began in a darkness so complete it felt solid, a cold, heavy blanket pressing against the thin glass of the windows. Mara rose in that darkness, her stockinged feet finding the cold floorboards by memory. The first sound was the metallic grate of the stove lid being lifted, a sharp scrape that broke the silence of the house. She fed dry kindling into the iron belly, her hands quick and practiced, and soon the smell of juniper and pine smoke began to fill the small kitchen, a welcome, pungent perfume against the chill. She moved through the pre-dawn quiet with a sense of purpose that was new to her. She collected the eggs from the small, shivering hens in the coop, their warmth a small comfort in her palms. She pumped water at the well, the handle a rod of ice, and set the heavy kettle on the stove to boil for coffee and oatmeal. As the sky began to bleed a pale, bruised gray in the east, Wren would emerge from the small bedroom she now shared with Mara. The child was always barefoot, her small, dirty feet padding silently on the wood. In her arms, she clutched a doll made from a scrap of burlap and two mismatched buttons for eyes. It was a crude, misshapen thing, but Wren held it with a fierce devotion, whispering to it as she climbed onto her stool at the rough-hewn table. Mara would set a bowl of warm oatmeal in front of her, and the two would eat in the growing light. The only sounds the scrape of their spoons and the quiet murmurings Wren directed at her doll. Calder was already gone. He rose in the same solid darkness as Mara, but moved in a different sphere. She would hear the faint jingle of a bridle, the soft stamp of a hoof, and then silence. He moved out onto the vast, empty land before the sun had even crested the distant mesas, a solitary figure chasing a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. He returned at dusk, defined by his labor. He didn't walk so much as trudge from the barn, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the day. He was a man coated in the territory, fine. Pale dust settled in the lines around his eyes, in the dark stubble of his beard, and on the sweat-dampened fabric of his shirt. He would pause on the porch, his back to the house, and use a tin basin of water to wash the worst of the grime from his face and hands before entering the home Mara had warmed. Their communication began on paper. The house was his, but the running of it was hers. and she found she needed to leave a record. She had no slate, so she used the blank flyleaf of a worn book of almanacs she found on a shelf. She tore a page carefully and, with a nub of pencil, wrote in her neat, clear hand, "Soup is on the stove. There is bread in the tin." The next day, she added more. "Wren has a fondness for the gray horse in the corral." And the day after, a simple statement of work completed, I mended the torn curtain in the main room. For 2 days, the notes vanished, and she assumed he simply read and discarded them. Then, on the 3rd morning, she came into the kitchen to find her last note returned to the table, beneath her script. In a heavy, square-topped hand that was almost violently different from the false letter were his replies. "Thank you. Her name is Ash. It looks better." Mara stared at the paper for a long time. Her name is Ash. He had given the horse a name for his daughter. He had affirmed her observation. It looks better. He had noticed her work. It was more than an acknowledgement. It was a conversation, held in silence, across the divide of the day. Life settled into a rhythm, marked not by hours, but by tasks. The land was demanding, and it shaped their days. One afternoon, a sudden storm blew in from the north, a common deceit of the high desert. The sky turned from a placid blue to a roiling, yellowish green in a matter of minutes. Mara had been hanging the week's laundry, Calder's heavy work shirts, Wren's small smocks, her own underthings on a line strung between 2 posts. The wind hit first, a physical shove that nearly knocked her off her feet. Then came the rain. Not a gentle shower, but a horizontal assault of hard, cold drops that stung her skin. "Oh, heavens!" she cried out, her voice snatched away by the gale. She lunged for the laundry, her hands clumsy as she fumbled with the wooden pins. The dry ground turned instantly to a slick, greasy mud known as caliche. As she wrestled a heavy, wet shirt from the line, her feet went out from under her. She landed hard on her backside, the wind knocking the breath from her lungs. For a second, she was just cold, muddy, and defeated. Then, looking at the absurd sight of herself sitting in the mud, clutching a man's shirt, a bubble of helpless laughter rose in her throat. It was a rusty sound, one she hadn't used in a long time, but it felt good. She was still sitting there, a small smile on her face, when a shadow fell over her. Calder was standing there, his hat pulled low, the rain streaming from the brim. He had come from the barn, a hammer in his hand. He didn't offer her a hand up. He didn't acknowledge her fall. He simply looked at the remaining laundry, still being whipped on the line, and then at the side of the house, with a speed that was startling. He strode to a pile of scrap lumber near the woodshed. In no more than a dozen heavy, precise blows of the hammer, he had nailed a longboard between the eaves of the house and the top of the fence post. He grabbed a loose sheet of tin and secured it over the top, creating a narrow, slanted roof. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it was shelter. He pointed to it, then to the remaining laundry. "Move the line." He turned and walked back to the barn. His work done, Mara, still muddy, scrambled to her feet. She moved the line, and as she finished her work under the new, noisy shelter, she understood. He hadn't helped her up because she was capable of getting up. He had solved the larger problem. He hadn't coddled her. He had protected her work. Dinner was the quietest time of all, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the empty, aching silence of her arrival. It was a shared quiet, filled with the small sounds of life, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, the scrape of Calder's chair as he leaned back, replete, and, most importantly, the sound of Wren, who had begun to giggle into her bowl of stew, a happy, bubbling sound that seemed to make the very air in the cabin warmer. Mara found herself studying Calder, learning his language. It was a language of subtraction, of small, deliberate gestures that meant more than most men's speeches. A nod so slight it was barely a movement of his chin meant yes or I agree. A sharper, Quicker dip of the head meant good. When he was leaving the house, a brief tap of his first 2 fingers to the brim of his hat before he turned his back was his thank you for the meal. She began to notice other things, patterns of behavior that spoke of the man beneath the silence. When a strong gust of wind, a common occurrence, rattled the door in its frame, he would invariably shift his position. If he was at the table, he would move his chair. If he was standing, he would take a half step. It took her a week to realize what he was doing. He was unconsciously, instinctively, placing his body between her and the door. It was the primal, unspoken instinct of a protector, a man who saw the world in terms of shelter and threat, and who had placed her and his daughter firmly on the side of shelter. The nights grew colder. The wind, no longer a summer breeze, became a moaning, howling entity that clawed at the corners of the log house and screamed down the chimney. On one such night, the sound was too much for Wren. She tossed in her small cot. Her breathing hitched until she finally sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with terror in the flickering firelight. "It's a monster," she whimpered, her hands clutching her burlap doll. Mara slid from her own bed and went to her, smoothing the tangled hair from her face. "No, sweetheart, it's just the wind. It's just a big, lonely sound looking for a place to rest." "Sing," Wren demanded, a small tremor in her voice. "I don't have much of a singing voice," Mara admitted softly, "but I can tell you a story my mother used to tell me." She settled on the edge of the cot, pulling the quilts up around them both. Calder was a motionless lump under his own blankets on the far side of the room, but she knew, somehow, that he was not asleep. He was listening. "This is the story," Mara began, her voice low and steady, a counter-rhythm to the gale outside, of the girl who carried the pine cone. She was very small, and the forest was very big. And one day, a great wind came, just like this one. It snapped the branches and scared all the animals. The girl was afraid, but she held on to her pine cone, and she kept walking, because she knew the pine cone held a secret. It held all the seeds for a whole new forest. She knew that as long as she held it, and as long as she kept walking, she was carrying the future, and that made her stronger than any wind. She kept talking, her voice a soft drone, spinning out the simple tale of the girl's journey, until Wren's breathing deepened, her small body relaxed, and her eyes finally drifted shut. Mara stayed for a long time, listening to the equal measures of the child's breath and the wind's howl. The work was relentless, from sunup to sundown. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She taught Wren her letters. She tended the small garden. She preserved the last of the harvest. She was fueled by a desperate need to prove her worth, to earn the safety Calder had offered. She pushed herself past exhaustion, her bones aching, her mind numb with fatigue. One evening, she was by the hearth, darning one of Calder's socks by the low firelight. She had just finished the stew. Wren was asleep, and Calder was checking the livestock one last time. She blinked, her eyes heavy, the needles slipping in her fingers. Just for a minute, she thought, letting her head rest against the rough stone of the fireplace. She woke to a sharp pain in her neck and the disorienting feeling of being cold. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was steeped in the pre-dawn chill. She was still sitting on the floor, slumped against the hearth. She had fallen asleep from pure, bone-deep weariness. As she tried to stand, her stiff muscles protesting, she realized something was different. A heavy wool blanket was tucked securely around her shoulders and waist. On the floor beside her sat a tin basin of clean, cool water, and on the hearth, placed on a clean plate, was a thick slice of fried cornmeal mush, golden brown and crisp, with a perfectly fried egg sitting on top. It was still warm. He had come in, found her collapsed, and had not woken her. He had covered her. He had fetched water for her to wash. And then the thought struck her with a force that made her sit back down. He had cooked for her. Her eyes scanned the room and found a slip of paper on her pillow. weighted down by her hairbrush. It was his square, heavy script. Rest today. I will manage the barn. Wren needs you healthy more than the chores. Mara picked up the note, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked at the blanket, at the water, at the food. Tears well-led in her eyes, hot and sudden. But they were not tears of shame or sadness. It was the shock of a kindness so profound and practical it completely disarmed her. All her life, she had been a tool for other people's needs, someone to be ordered, corrected, and used. She had been valued only for the work her hands could do. This was the first time in her entire life that anyone had put her well-being first. The first time anyone had seen her not as a pair of hands, but as a person. The first time she had ever been, in the truest sense of the word, cared for. The cold arrived like an uninvited guest, slipping under the door and through the chinks in the logs with the blade of a knife. The thin blankets they used in the mild autumn were suddenly, pitifully inadequate. The house needed its winter armor. Mara knew there were heavier wools and quilts stored away, and the only place for them was the attic. It was a low, triangular space above the main room, accessed by a crude ladder hidden in the back of the pantry. She had not been up there. It felt like a border she had instinctively not crossed, a space that still belonged to the past. But the cold was biting, and Wren had shivered in her cot all night. Calder was out, miles away, checking the southern fence line where the wire had snapped. Wren was blessedly asleep, her burlap doll clutched to her chest. Now was the time. She pulled the heavy ladder down, the hinges groaning in protest. The air that descended was different, not just cold, but still, holding the scent of things long undisturbed. It was the pungent, clean smell of dried cedar shavings, the musty comfort of old wool, and the fine, mineral tang of dust that had not seen the light of day in years. Mara climbed, her head emerging into the low-beamed space. It was larger than she expected, running the full length of the house. Golden shafts of afternoon light, thick with dancing dust motes, pierced the gloom from a single, grime-caked window at the far end. Stacks of bundled hides, old tools, and broken pieces of harness lay in organized piles, and in the corner, a stack of heavy quilts. As she reached for them, her hand brushed against the lid of a small, unadorned pine chest. It was not locked. The lid, in fact, was slightly ajar, as if someone had closed it in a hurry, or perhaps had intended to return to it. It was not her business. Her purpose was the blankets, but her fingers, as if acting of their own accord, hooked under the lid. She felt a pang of guilt, a hot flush of shame at her own prying, but it was overwhelmed by a deeper, more compelling need to understand the silence that filled this house. She lifted the lid. The chest was not full. It held only a few carefully preserved items. The first thing she saw was a dress, impossibly small, sewn by hand from soft, faded calico. It was a baby dress, one Wren must have worn in her first year. Beside it lay a pair of tiny moccasins, the hide worn soft, the beadwork intricate, a pattern of blue and white triangles that was clearly not the work of a settler. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the moccasins. Beneath them was a comb, carved from dark horn, its spine inlaid with a single, smooth piece of sky-blue turquoise. It was an item of personal, feminine vanity, beautiful and cherished. She could almost feel the weight of a hand that had once drawn it through thick, dark hair. And then, at the very bottom, tucked beneath a folded muslin shawl, was a piece of artist's paper, rolled and tied with a leather thong. This, she knew, was the heart of it. This was the secret. She untied the thong, her breath held tight in her chest. She unrolled the paper carefully, the charcoal whispering against the surface. It was a portrait, drawn with a hand that possessed more love than technical skill, but the likeness was undeniable. The emotion captured with a raw, honest power. There he was, Calder, But it was a Calder she had never known. He was younger, his face unmarred by the scar, his shoulders relaxed. He was looking at the artist, and he was smiling. It was not the small ghost of a smile she had seen him give Wren. It was a wide, unguarded, joyful smile that lit his entire face. In his arms, he held a bundled infant, a tiny, round-faced baby that could only be Wren, and beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her head tilted slightly toward his, was the woman. She was Native American. Her dark hair was parted in the middle and fell in two thick braids over her shoulders. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted ladies in the magazines that came west, but her face held a profound, captivating beauty. Her features were strong, her mouth gentle, but it was her eyes that held Mara captive. They were just as she had seen them in the child honey dark, intelligent and filled with a quiet, resilient strength. She looked at Calder with an expression of such complete and encompassing love that it was almost painful to witness. A cold, sharp ache seized Mara's chest, a grief that was not her own but that she felt with the force of a physical blow. It was the drawing of a family, whole and happy. This was what had been lost. This was the source of the silence that governed Mesquite Gate Ranch. It wasn't just the absence of speech. It was the echoing, active presence of this devastating loss. She suddenly felt like a trespasser, a ghost haunting a home that was not hers. She was a patch, like the ones on her dress, a clumsy repair over a hole that was still raw and bleeding. Her hands were shaking now, visibly. She carefully, reverently, rolled the sketch and retied the leather thong. She placed it back in the chest, settled the comb, the moccasins, the tiny dress. She closed the lid. It shut with a soft, final thud. She grabbed the heavy quilts, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She backed down the ladder, her foot slipping on the last rung. The creak of the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent, waiting house. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was no longer the comfortable, companionable quiet of their shared routine. It was brittle, heavy, and charged with things unsaid. Mara could not meet Calder's eyes. She felt the weight of the drawing in her lap. Though it was locked away in the darkness above them, she served the stew, her hands stiff, her movements wooden. After Wren was settled in her cot, humming herself to sleep, Mara fled. She couldn't bear the warmth of the stove or the confines of the walls. She pushed open the door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight. The air was frigid, sharp as glass in her lungs. The sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, punctured by stars so bright and cold they looked like chips of ice. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a lonely, sibilant sound. She heard the hinge squeak behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Calder. He stood in the doorway, a dark, broad silhouette against the warm firelight of the cabin. He didn't step out. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, waiting. His presence was a question, a silent inquiry into the new sadness that clung to her like the cold. She kept her back to him, staring out at the dark line of the mesas. "Please don't," she whispered, her voice so thin the wind nearly stole it. "Not yet." He stood there for another long moment. She felt his gaze on her back, a heavy, searching weight. Then, with an almost imperceptible sound, he closed the door, leaving her alone with the cold and the stars. The next morning brought Ephra Thatch, their closest neighbor. If 5 miles of scrubland could be called close, he was a man made of sun-baked leather and gnarled bone, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to have seen the beginning of the world and was not impressed by it. He came by every few weeks, ostensibly to trade fresh eggs for Mara's canned peaches, but she suspected it was really to check on Calder and Wren, a duty he had taken upon himself. He found Mara at the well, hauling up the heavy bucket. Her movements were sluggish, her shoulders slumped. He dismounted his mule, took the rope from her hand, and secured it. "You look like you've seen a ghost, girl," he said, his voice a dry rattle. Mara just shook her head, unable to find the words. Ephra looked at her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the new tension in her jaw, the shadows under her eyes. He sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to come from the dust itself. "So," he said, not unkindly, "you went into the attic. You saw the drawing." It wasn't a question. Mara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Ain't no other reason for a woman to look like that in this house," Ephra continued, leaning against the well's stone wall. "Figured you would, sooner or later. That attic holds more than dust and blankets." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Her name was Ayanna. She was Ute, and she was worth more than this whole damn territory put together. She taught Calder how to read the water, how to find medicine in the weeds when Wren had a fever. Hell, she taught him how to smile. Hadn't seen him do that much before her." Mara stood frozen, her hands clinging to the cold stone of the well. "This town," Ephra said, his voice hardening. "It don't take kindly to things it don't understand, especially not happiness. The folks down in Sagebrush Hollow, the good, church-going folks, they used names for her, said she was unclean, said a savage woman spoiled the good land, just because she knew the earth better than they ever will." He paused, his eyes turning toward the hollow, where the small church bell hung silent. "And then there's the Red Hand Riders. You've seen 'em. Cole and his bunch. Young, rich, bored, and mean as snakes. They get their name from thinking they're the ones to cleanse the land. They get their entitlement from their fathers, who own the bank and the biggest herds." He kicked at a stone. "One night, almost 3 years ago now, they'd been drinking. They decided it was time to teach the mute man a lesson about mixing blood. They rode out here. They found Ayanna in the barn. Calder was out, just like he was yesterday, checking a fence line. They took her." Ephra's voice dropped, the rattle gone, replaced by a cold, flat anger. "They took her to the chapel, and they strung her up from the bell tower, left her there as a message." Mara made a small, choked sound. Her knuckles went white on the stone. She stared into the dark circle of the well, and the reflection of the sky on the water's surface trembled and broke apart, just as her heart was doing. "And Calder?" she whispered. "He got back as they were leaving," Ephra said, his voice grim. "He fought. Lord, how he fought! Like a cornered lion. But it was 6 of them. They held him down. They wanted him to watch what they'd done. When he wouldn't stop screaming, wouldn't stop cursing them. One of them, Jory, the one with the shaky hands, they made him do it. They took a blade and they cut his voice right out of him. Said it was a fair trade, an eye for an eye, a voice for a life. They left him there in the dirt beside her. He woke up 2 days later. She was gone. His voice was gone. And little Wren, barely a year old, was in that house, crying from hunger." Mara felt sick. A cold, profound rage, purer and deeper than any she had ever known, filled her. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't malice. This was an extermination, a casual act of profound evil, done by boys who had never faced a consequence. Ephra pushed himself off the well. "He ain't been the same. The house ain't been the same. Till you came." He picked up his basket of eggs. "Just be gentle with him. Girl, he's carrying more than most." He left her there. Mara stood by the well for a long time, the wind pulling at her hair, the water in the bucket vibrating with the tremor that ran through her body. She returned to the cabin and worked like an automaton. Her hands scrubbed, chopped, and mended. But her mind was dark, standing in the shadow of a bell tower. Wren ran to her, holding up the burlap doll. "Mama," she chirped, a name she'd now used for Mara when she was happy. "Dolly heard a story tell. Tell the pinecone one." The cheerful, innocent sound of "Mama" was like a slap. Mara froze. She looked at the child, at her honey-dark eyes, Ayanna's eyes, and she felt a chasm open beneath her. She couldn't She couldn't be this. She couldn't be the woman who stayed in a dead woman's house, raising a dead woman's child, loving a man who was haunted by a ghost she could never compete with. She was not a replacement. She was not a comfort. She was just there. That night, after the cabin was still, after Wren's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, Mara moved. She pulled her canvas bag from under the cot. With shaking hands, she began to fold her few possessions, her spare dress, her nightgown, her brush. She would leave. She would walk to Sagebrush Hollow at first light and take her chances. Anything was better than being a ghost. The door opened. Calder had come in from his last check of the barn. He stopped dead. The moonlight from the window cut across the room, illuminating her, her bag, and the small, folded pile of her clothes. His face, usually so guarded, went utterly blank. It was a mask of stone, but his eyes were full of a terrible, wounded understanding. He didn't move. He just watched her. The silence was suffocating. Mara felt a sudden, desperate need to break it. To explain, she grabbed the small slate and the chalk from the mantel. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely form the letters. "I am not her." She held it up. He looked at the words for a long, agonizing moment. Then he walked past her, took the slate from her trembling hands, and picked up the chalk. His own hand was perfectly steady. He wrote, his square letters precise and dark. "I know." The simple affirmation broke her. Tears she hadn't known she was holding streamed down her face. She took the slate back, her tears spotting the dusty surface. Why did you let me stay? Why let me find those things?" He watched her write, his expression unreadable. He took the slate, wiped it clean with the palm of his hand, and wrote again. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as if carving the words into stone. "Because Wren laughs when you are here, the house is warm again." Mara read the words, and read them again. He wasn't asking her to be Ayanna. He wasn't asking her to replace the woman in the drawing, the woman with the gentle, resilient eyes. He was asking her to be Mara. He was asking, quite simply, for the laughter and the warmth. He was asking for life to be allowed back inside. She looked at her canvas bag. She looked at the man standing before her, his throat scarred, his eyes full of a grief she could now, finally, understand. Slowly, her hands still shaking, she reached into the bag, took out her folded dress, and placed it back in the wooden drawer. The morning had begun with the promise of ordinary, quiet work. The air was so cold it felt brittle, but the sun was high and bright, making the frost on the fence posts sparkle. Mara was scrubbing the porch steps, the harsh lye soap biting at her hands, but the rhythmic work was a comfort. Wren was sitting nearby, wrapped in a blanket, reading a story to her burlap doll, her small voice a happy, nonsensical murmur. Calder was in the barn, the steady thwack of his axe splitting firewood providing a solid rhythm to the day. It was a domestic, peaceful sound, the sound of a home finding its heartbeat. The piece didn't just break, it was torn apart. The sound came first, not the axe, but the drumming of hooves. Too many of them. Coming too fast, and with it, that laughter. It was a sound Mara had learned to despise in her short time here, the high, braying laughter of young men, fueled by arrogance and a casual cruelty that came from never having faced a consequence. Mara stood, wiping her wet hands on her apron. Her heart didn't just sink, it turned to a cold, heavy stone in her gut. She saw them crest the low ridge. 5 of them, backlit by the morning sun like a dark parody of saviors. The Red Hand Riders. They reined in at the sagging wire gate, a ragged line of insolence. Cole, the leader, sat his expensive horse with a lazy slump, a smirk already on his face. Jory, the one Ephra had said possessed shaky hands, looked nervous, as he always did. Pike, the youngest, looked eager. "Mornin', bride!" Cole shouted. his voice carrying easily in the thin air, a deliberate violation of the morning's quiet. "How's the honeymoon? Is the mute man satisfying you? Or is he as quiet in the bedroom as he is at the saloon?" The others hooted. Brant, the heavy-set one, spat a stream of tobacco. Maybe she likes some quiet, doesn't have to listen to any sweet talk. "Hey, Boone!" Cole yelled, turning his attention to the barn, from which Calder had now emerged. The axe held loosely at his side. He stood in the shadow of the barn door, a silent, watchful figure. "We heard you found your voice. Heard you squealed real good when Jory gave you that pretty necklace. Sing us a song." The world seemed to narrow for Mara. The lie, the cold, the child, it all fell away. All that existed was the raw, vibrating anger she felt for these boys. She didn't walk back into the house. She stepped off the porch and onto the hard-packed dirt of the yard. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in a low, level tone that cut through their laughter like a razor. "One more word," she said, her eyes locked on Cole, "and you'll be tasting this dirt." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the laughter exploded, louder this time, incredulous. They were laughing at her, a small woman in a faded apron, with soap suds on her arms. "Ooh," Pike jeered, his voice cracking with false bravado. "The mail order's got claws." "What are you gonna do, little lady?" Cole mocked, leaning forward on his pommel, the smirk returning. "Scold us. You gonna wash our mouths out with that soap?" Mara turned, not in retreat, but with purpose. She walked back into the house, her steps measured. The men hooted, thinking they'd won. "That's it, run back inside, little mouse." She reappeared a second later. In her hands was Calder's double-barreled shotgun. It was heavy, but she held it with an authority that was absolute. She didn't raise it, not yet. She just stood on the porch, the weapon resting in the crook of her arm. Then, with a deliberate, practiced motion of her thumb, she pulled back both hammers. Click, click. The sound was impossibly loud. It was the sound of oiled steel and finality. It was, as the outline had suggested, loud enough to silence the wind. The laughter died instantly, choked off in their throats. Now she raised it. The stock was not perfectly seated, but it was firm enough. The twin muzzles aimed squarely at the center of Cole's chest. "I said," Mara repeated, her voice as cold and hard as the gun's barrel. "This is done. Take one more step onto this land, and I will shoot. This is our home." The word hung in the air, defiant and immovable. The standoff stretched, thin and tight. Cole's eyes flickered from Mara's face to the dark, twin holes of the shotgun. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was calculating. He was measuring the distance, the woman, the likelihood that she would actually pull the trigger. From the corner of her eye, Mara saw movement. Calder. He walked out from the shadow of the barn, the axe left behind. His hands were empty, open at his sides. He didn't walk to the porch to stand behind her. He walked past the porch, down the steps, and stood in the yard. A few feet to her left, he placed himself between her and the riders. Unarmed, a silent wall. His back was ramrod straight, like a newly set fence post. He didn't look at Mara. He just stared at Cole, his face expressionless, his presence an unassailable fact. He was a target, and he was offering himself as one. The combined force, the armed woman who looked ready to kill and the unarmed man who looked ready to die, was too much for them. The bravado was a thin veneer, and it had just been stripped away. Cole's face twisted. He was used to victims. He was used to cowering, to fear, to the power his father's name gave him. He was not used to this. He spat in the dust, a gesture of profound contempt to cover his retreat. "She ain't worth the lead, boys," he sneered, his voice tight. He pulled his horse's head around, a movement far rougher than necessary. "Let the mute man have his trash. Let him rot out here." He wheeled his horse, the others following suit. A disorderly, sullen pack. They were leaving. Mara felt a tremor run through her arms. The shotgun suddenly weighing 100 pounds. She had won. She could breathe again. It happened in a fraction of a second. As they rode off, Pike, the youngest one, the one with the eager, vicious eyes, looked back. He was perhaps 20 yards away, a distance of perfect, cowardly safety. With a sudden, spiteful flick of his wrist, he threw the empty whiskey bottle he'd been holding. It wasn't aimed at Mara. It was aimed at Calder. It arced through the air, a brown glass blur against the bright blue sky. Calder saw it coming but didn't have time to do more than turn slightly. To shield his head, the bottle shattered against his left shoulder. An explosion of glass and sound. Calder staggered. A grunt of pure, sharp pain forced from his chest. He clutched his shoulder. Dark blood instantly soaking the sleeve of his chambray shirt. A sound tore from Mara's throat. A sound she didn't recognize. It was a raw, animalistic scream of pure rage and terror. Calder. It was the first time she had ever said his name aloud. It felt like breaking a vow. The riders were gone, their whooping, triumphant laughter echoing as they galloped away, victorious in their cowardice. Mara dropped the shotgun in the dirt. She ran to him, grabbing his good arm. "Inside! Get inside! Now!" He was steady, his jaw clenched, his face pale beneath the tan. But he let her guide him. As they stumbled through the doorway, a small, terrified figure appeared. Wren. She had seen it all from the window. She didn't scream. She just made a high, thin wailing sound and attached herself to Calder's leg, her small hands clinging to his trousers, her face buried in the fabric as she sobbed. The kitchen, moments ago a place of domestic peace, became a field hospital. "Sit," Mara commanded, her voice shaking but firm. Calder sat heavily in the chair by the table, his breathing harsh. Wren was still clinging to him, her small body shuddering with terror. "Wren," Mara said, her voice surprisingly gentle as she pried the child's fingers loose. "Go to your cot. Take your doll. Now. Your papa is hurt, and I have to be the doctor." The child, seeing the iron in Mara's eyes, an authority she had never witnessed before, obeyed. She backed away, her small sobs muffled in her burlap doll, and disappeared into the bedroom. Mara grabbed a knife from the counter and slit Calder's shirt from collar to waist. The wool and cotton, soaked in blood, fell away. The wound was ugly. The glass had laid open a long, jagged gash across his shoulder and collarbone. It was bleeding freely, but the fragments embedded in the flesh were the main danger. "This will hurt," she said, her voice dropping. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey they kept for medicine and, without hesitating, poured it directly into the wound. Calder hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his entire body going rigid. His good hand gripped the arm of the chair, his knuckles turning white, but he made no sound. His eyes locked on hers, wide with a pain that stole his breath, but they were trusting. Her hands, which had been so steady with the shotgun, were trembling now, but her fingers were sure. She took the tweezers from her sewing box, sterilized them in the bottle's neck, and began the agonizing work of picking the shards of brown glass from his flesh. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the sharp tink of glass dropping into a tin bowl, Calder's ragged, controlled breathing, and the muffled sobs of Wren from the bedroom. Mara worked, her face inches from his, her own breath held, sweat beading on her forehead. She saw the old, silvery scar on his throat, stark and white, and just below it, the fresh, red ruin. Their eyes never broke contact. It was a communication more profound than any words. She was seeing his pain, his vulnerability, his unflinching strength. He was seeing her. Not the mail-order bride, not the hired help, but the woman who had just declared his home her home, and who was now, with gentle, steady hands, putting him back together. When the last shard was out, she patted the wound with clean cloth and began to bind it, wrapping strips of clean linen tight around his shoulder and chest. the bandage stark white against his tanned, blood-streaked skin. He was pale, leaning back in the chair. The immediate crisis over. The silence returned, but it was heavy, filled with the aftermath of violence. Mara was cleaning her hands in the basin, her back to him. When she heard him move, she turned. He had taken the slate from the mantel. His left arm was bound tight to his body, but with his right, he had scrawled 2 words, the chalk marks unsteady from the pain and the weakness. Stay for pity. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fear. Don't stay out of pity. Mara looked at the slate. She looked at his face, drawn and exhausted, his eyes full of a new, more terrible vulnerability. He thought she was staying because he was wounded, because she felt sorry for him, because he was, once again, a victim she felt bound to. She walked over to him, not to the slate. She took the final linen strip she was using to tie off the bandage. She pulled it tight, her hands over his wound, and tied a firm, secure knot. She met his gaze. Her own was fierce, clear, and utterly without pity. I am not staying because I feel sorry for you. Calder. Her voice was low, vibrating with a new, powerful conviction. I am staying because this is my home. I am staying because of Wren. And I am staying. She pressed her hand lightly over the bandage, feeling the heat of his skin through the cloth. Because of you. I am staying because I choose to. His eyes searched hers, digging deep, looking for the lie, for the soft center of pity. He found none. He found only steel. His mouth opened. A strange, rasping sound came from his throat, a sound of air being forced over vocal cords that had been silent for years, stiff with disuse and thick with scar tissue. His face contorted with the effort, the muscles in his scarred neck straining. He pushed the air out, forcing it into a shape. Stay. It was not a word. It was a bare, guttural rasp, a piece of broken sound, hoarse and cracked as the dry earth. But it was his. It was the first word he had spoken in 3 years. From the bedroom, a tiny, watery gasp. Papa! Wren stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face streaked with tears, her doll clutched to her chest. She had heard it. Calder looked at his daughter, then back at Mara, a look of profound, staggering shock on his own face. He had spoken. Mara's composure, the iron will that had held the gun, tended the wound, and made her declaration, finally broke. The tears came, not in a polite trickle, but in a sudden, cleansing flood, like a summer rain breaking a month-long drought. She didn't sob. She just stood there, letting them fall, her hand still on his shoulder. He was here. She was here. They had held the line, and in the wreckage, something new had been spoken into existence. The days that followed the confrontation were suspended in a strange, fragile peace. The violence had been a storm that had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. But the ground was still soft, the trees still bent. Calder's shoulder was healing. The wound clean and bound in the white linen Mara changed every morning. He moved stiffly, his left arm mostly useless, which forced a new, awkward intimacy upon them. She had to help him with his shirt buttons, a task that made her fingers feel clumsy and oversized. He had to allow her to saddle his horse, a surrender of self-sufficiency that she knew cost him a great deal. They didn't speak of the attack, but it was a constant, silent presence. The shared memory of a line drawn in the dirt, a shotgun held steady, and a single, broken word forced from a scarred throat. Then the sandstorm came. It was a biblical event, a wall of churning, ochre-colored dust that blotted out the sun and screamed for a day and a night. They were sealed inside the cabin, the world reduced to the 4 log walls and the howling fury outside. The fine dust was insidious, finding its way through every crack, coating every surface with a gritty film, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Calder stuffed rags into the gaps around the door and window frames. Mara kept a kettle steaming on the stove to add moisture to the air. Wren, terrified by the roaring wind and the unnatural twilight, spent most of the day in Mara's lap, listening to the story of the Pinecone Girl over and over, her small face buried in Mara's shoulder. When it was over suddenly. The wind dropped, and a profound, ringing silence fell. Outside, the world was remade. The landscape softened and sculpted into new, unfamiliar shapes by the dunes of sand. The air inside the cabin was still and heavy. That night, after a meager dinner of beans and biscuits, the atmosphere was different. The storm had confined them, forced them into a proximity that was more than physical. They had weathered it together. Wren, exhausted by her fear, fell asleep almost instantly. Her small body curled into a tight ball in her cot. Her burlap doll held fast. The only sound in the room was the soft, contented crackle of the fire Calder had built in the hearth. The flames licked at a log of dry mesquite, casting a warm, flickering light that made the shadows dance in the corners of the room. It was a cozy, protected space, a small island of warmth and light in the vast, cold dark of the territory. Mara busied herself, not because there was work to be done, but because the stillness felt too charged, too full of unspoken things. She heated water and steeped a tea from the dried mint and chamomile she kept in a tin. It was a soothing, gentle smell. She poured the steaming, fragrant liquid into 2 tin mugs, one for her, one for Calder. He was sitting in his usual chair by the fire, his back to her. He hadn't put on a clean shirt. The one he wore was dusty and open at the neck, revealing the white bandage that wrapped his shoulder and chest. He was staring into the flames, his posture one of deep, weary contemplation. His hat sat on the floor beside him. She walked over to him, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She set one of the mugs on the small, rough-hewn table beside his chair. The metallic scrape of the mug on the wood was a small, sharp sound in the quiet. He didn't turn, he just sat there, watching the fire. She stood for a moment, uncertain. She could retreat to her own side of the hearth, drink her tea, and let the silence stretch until it was time for sleep. That was the safe thing to do. That was the pattern they had established. But something had broken open that morning on the porch. A wall had been breached, not just by the riders, but between them. She had claimed this house as hers. She had tended his wound. He had spoken. They could not go back to being a man and his hired help. Slowly, as if in a dream, he moved. His right hand, the good one, lifted from the arm of the chair. It moved through the firelight, a strong, capable hand, the knuckles scarred, the palm and fingers layered with the calluses of a lifetime of hard labor. It moved with a profound hesitation, a visible uncertainty that was more eloquent than any word. He did not reach for the mug of tea. He reached for her. His hand stopped just short of hers, hovering in the warm air between them. Then, with an almost agonizing slowness, he laid the back of his hand against the back of hers, where it rested on the table. It was not a grasp, not a claim. It was a question. The touch was light, almost weightless, his calloused skin a rough, warm counterpoint to her own. "Is this all right?" the touch asked. "May I?" A tremor ran through her, a current of heat that started in her hand and spread up her arm, into her chest, where it settled around her heart. She did not pull away. To pull away would be to rebuild the wall, to deny the truth of what had passed between them. She turned her hand over, palm up, and laced her fingers through his. His hand closed around hers, a firm, warm grasp that was both a relief and a new kind of tension. Their joined hands rested on the table, bathed in the firelight. She could feel his pulse, a slow, steady beat against her own, which was fluttering like a trapped bird. She watched as their heartbeats found a common rhythm, a shared, silent cadence. For a long time, they sat like that, joined, silent, watching the flames. The fire consumed the log, the wood collapsing into a bed of glowing, orange embers. The shadows in the room deepened. He moved again, a small shift in his chair. He turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time he had truly, fully looked at her in the quiet intimacy of the night. His face, illuminated by the soft, flickering light, was stripped of its usual guarded mask. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the pain that still lingered in the tight set of his jaw. The firelight played along the silvery line of the scar on his throat, making it seem less like a wound and more like a map of the man he had become. Slowly, Mara lifted her free hand. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently, so gently, laid her palm against his throat, her fingers resting over the scar. It was not a gesture of pity. Pity was an insult. It was a gesture of acceptance. Her touch said, "I see this. I know what it cost you. And I am not afraid." His skin was warm, the stubble of his beard rough against her palm. He closed his eyes for a second, a flicker of something pain, memory, relief passing over his face. He leaned into her touch, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible. But it was a surrender, a yielding. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and now he began to move, to lean toward her. There was no rush, no urgency. It was a slow, deliberate advance, a study in patience. It was as if they were learning a new dance, a slow, hesitant waltz with no music but the sound of their own breathing. He was watching her, his eyes searching hers, asking permission with every silent inch he closed between them. She watched him back, her own gaze unwavering, granting that permission. They were learning each other's breath, the way it hitched and deepened, a language more ancient and honest than words. His face was inches from hers now. She could feel the warmth of his skin, see the flecks of gold in the dark brown of his eyes. He stopped, giving her the final choice, the last chance to turn away. Her lips parted. A whisper escaped, a sound that was both a surrender and a declaration. "I want to—" It was a thread of sound in the vast silence, but it was an unbreakable bond. It was a clear, unambiguous consent, a statement of her own desire, her own choice. A change came over his face. The tension in his jaw eased. A small, fleeting smile, the first she had ever seen directed at her, touched the corners of his mouth. It was a beautiful, startling thing, like seeing a desert flower bloom in the moonlight. He gave a single, slow nod. "Me too." He was the first to move, to break the spell. He straightened up, his hand still holding hers. With his good hand, he shrugged out of his dusty work shirt, letting it fall to the floor. The firelight played over the hard muscles of his chest and the clean white bandage that wrapped his shoulder. Then he turned his attention to her. She was wearing a simple wool shawl against the night's chill. He reached for it, his calloused fingertips brushing her collarbone. He untied the knot, his movements a little clumsy, a little unsure. He eased the shawl from her shoulders, his touch gentle, respectful. Her dress was a simple cotton garment, fastened with a row of small, mismatched buttons. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the first one. He looked at her, his eyes asking again. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His fingers, so strong and sure when handling an axe or a horse, fumbled slightly with the tiny button. It was a sign of his nervousness, of the profound importance of this moment. He was not taking, he was being given. He worked his way down, one button at a time, his touch never rough, his pace unhurried. With each button that came undone, he would pause, his eyes meeting hers, waiting for her silent assent to continue. When the last button was free, he eased the dress from her shoulders. The cool air touched her skin, raising goosebumps, but she did not shiver. He drew her to her feet and wrapped one of the heavy wool blankets from his cot around her, cocooning her in its warmth. Her bare shoulders pressed against the soft, scratchy wool. He drew her close. His good arm went around her back, his hand spreading wide and firm at the small of her back, supporting her, steadying her. Her own arms went up, her hands linking behind his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick, unruly hair at his nape. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire and passion, but one of deep, soul-shaking tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of homecoming. It was slow and deep, a rediscovery of a language he had long forgotten. His lips were soft, questioning, and she answered him with a yielding of her own. Their bodies found each other not with fumbling urgency, but with a quiet, certain trust. This was not a claiming, it was a recognition. The world outside the circle of their embrace ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the scent of wood smoke and chamomile, and the solid, reassuring presence of each other. Their breathing quickened, then slowed, falling into a shared rhythm. He broke the kiss, but only to rest his forehead against hers. Their eyes closed, their breath mingling in the small space between them. A floorboard creaked under their combined weight. In the deep, profound quiet, the sound was startlingly loud. A small, surprised laugh escaped Mara's lips. She felt, rather than saw, Calder's smile against her forehead. It was a moment of shared, simple joy that was more intimate than the kiss itself. He scooped her up, his one good arm surprisingly strong, and carried her the few feet to the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. He laid her down gently and stretched out beside her, pulling the heavy wool blanket over them both. They lay there for a long time, side by side, his hand once again finding hers in the darkness. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing coals, painting the room in soft shades of red and orange. Mara turned her head on the thick fur of the rug. "I'm staying," she whispered into the quiet. It was a promise, a vow. He squeezed her hand. She felt him draw a breath, gathering himself. The rasp came again, the sound of a voice fighting its way through scar tissue and disuse. "I thank you." The two words were a monumental effort. They were rough, broken, and more beautiful than any poem she had ever heard. They were a sunrise. They lay there, listening to the wind as it began to stir again outside. A low, mournful sigh across the sand-swept land, but the sound was no longer lonely. It was just the wind. The silence in the cabin was no longer an absence, but a presence. It was a silence that held the crackle of the embers, the sound of their breathing, the steady, rhythmic beat of two hearts that had, against all odds, found their way home. The invisible line between the man who owned the house and the woman who worked in it had dissolved into the warm, firelit air. They were no longer two separate, lonely people. They were, in the quiet, gentle dark, simply and radiantly, each other's. The first sign of the change was a bright, improbable splash of color, a traveling peddler. His wagon laden with the small luxuries that made life on the frontier bearable, had passed by. Mara, with the few dollars she had hoarded, bought 10 yards of cotton fabric. It was a pale, hopeful shade of blue, the color of a robin's egg or a clear morning sky after a storm. For 2 days, the kitchen table was covered in the stuff. Mara cut and measured, her shears making a satisfying snick-snick sound through the new cloth. She sewed by hand in the evenings, her stitches small and even. Calder watched her, his good hand resting on his knee, his bad shoulder still bound, though he moved with less pain now. He watched the way the firelight caught the determination in her profile, the quick, practiced way her needle flashed in and out of the blue fabric. When she was done, she replaced the heavy, sun-faded burlap sacks that had served as curtains. The effect was immediate and profound. The harsh, glaring light of the high desert was gentled, filtered through the light blue fabric, and the small, dark kitchen was suddenly filled with a soft, cheerful glow. It was like breathing in clean, cool water. Wren stood in the middle of the room and spun in a slow circle, her arms outstretched, her face tilted up to the new blue light. "It's the sky," she whispered. "You brought the sky inside." The curtains made Mara see the rest of the room with new eyes. It was clean. It was warm. But it was bare. It was a place to survive. Not yet a place to live. "Wren needs a place for her things," she said, more to herself than to Calder. "For the stones she collects, and her doll, and books, when we get them." In the woodshed, she found several long, straight pine boards, left over from a repair to the corral. They were rough, but they were sound. She brought them in, her mind already working. She had never built furniture, but she had mended everything, and she understood how things fit together. It became a project for all three of them. Mara measured and marked, using a piece of charcoal. She started the sawing, but the work was heavy, and Calder, seeing her struggle, stepped in. He took the saw in his right hand. He couldn't use his left to steady the wood, so he braced it against the wall with his knee, his movements awkward but powerful. The sound of the saw, its rhythmic, tearing breath, filled the cabin for an afternoon. Then came the assembly. Mara held the boards in place, her hands flush against the raw wood, while Calder, his shoulder protesting but obeying, drove the nails. He hammered with his right arm, a series of short, efficient blows. Thwack, thwack, thwack! It was the sound of construction, of permanence. It was the sound of a roof, a wall, a home being built, not just occupied. When the simple, sturdy shelves were built and standing, slightly crooked. In the corner, Wren was given her task. Mara had found a small, half-empty can of whitewash in the barn. "Now," Mara told her, "you make it beautiful." Wren, delighted, dipped her entire hand into the chalky, white liquid. She pressed her palm flat against the lowest shelf, leaving a perfect, small handprint. She did it again and again, creating a clumsy, joyful border of tiny, white hands. She was a creator, a builder, just as they were. By the time she was finished, she was covered in whitewash, as was the floor. But the bookshelf was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a monument to their shared labor, marked with the signature of its smallest builder. Mara found an old, leather-bound ledger that was empty save for the first few pages, which had been neatly cut out. She took her pencil, sharpened it, and sat at the table under the light of her new blue curtains. She began to write. She wrote down the stories her mother had told her, the ones she had told Wren from memory. She wrote the story of the clever fox who tricked the river, of the tall mountain that remembered the names of all the people who had ever lived in its shadow, and of a woman who tamed a wild horse not with a rope, but with patience. She wrote in her neat, clear script, her hand steady, preserving the words, giving them a home just as Calder had given her one. One afternoon, Calder came in from the barn, where he had been repairing a broken harness. He was quiet, but Mara noticed his hands were stained black with charcoal. Wren, who had been sitting with him, ran to Mara, her face alight with a secretive pride. She held up a piece of slate. "Look," she cried. "Look, Papa showed me." On the slate was a drawing. It was simple, almost childish, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a picture of two figures, one tall, one small, holding hands. They were standing under a tree, one that was tilted sharply to the left, like the old, wind-bent cottonwood that grew by the dry creek bed. Mara looked from the drawing to Calder. He was watching Wren, a look of quiet, profound tenderness on his face. He had found a way to bridge the silence, to teach his daughter to communicate in a language that was his own. He was teaching her to speak with pictures. Mara felt a familiar ache in her chest, but this time it was not grief. It was a fullness, a feeling of something precious being mended. She turned back to the table, and there, lying next to her half-finished storybook, was another piece of paper with Calder's heavy, square script on it. It was a note he must have left while she was outside. So she can have a voice everywhere, even if no one gives permission. Mara pressed her fingers to her lips. She understood. He was not just teaching his daughter to draw. He was arming her. He was giving her a tool, a way to speak that no man, no knife, could ever cut from her throat. He was ensuring his child would never be silenced as he had been. That night, dinner was a quiet celebration. Mara had found a patch of stubborn, purple wildflowers blooming in the shelter of a large rock. She had picked them and placed them in a clear glass jar in the middle of the table. They were a small, fragile, defiant patch of color against the rough wood. A tiny signal of peace. The knock on the door a few days later was so unexpected it made them all jump. It was Reverend Silas Marin, the minister from the small adobe church in Sagebrush Hollow. He was a kind man, his face weathered but his eyes warm. He had been a friend to Ayanna. Ephra had told her, and had been the one to defy the town and give her a proper burial. "Miss Linden," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Boone." He nodded to Calder, who nodded back. "I was riding the circuit, and I saw the new curtains from the ridge, a very welcoming blue." "Please, come in, Reverend," Mara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I offer you some coffee?" That would be a blessing. He sat at the table, his presence filling the small cabin. He accepted the coffee, his gaze taking in the small, clean room. He saw the bookshelf, and his eyes lingered on the small, white handprints. He saw the jar of flowers. He saw the way Wren, after a moment of shyness, crept from behind Mara's skirts to show him her drawing on the slate. He smiled. "That's the old cottonwood. Isn't it a fine likeness, young lady?" He turned his warm, searching gaze on Mara, and then on Calder. "This house, it feels different," he said softly. "It feels like a home again. The Lord's work is not always done in a church. It is done in the mending of walls and of spirits." He took a sip of his coffee. His next words were gentle, but they held the weight of the world outside their small ranch. "I am a man of God, but I am also a man of record. The town. They talk. They see a woman living here, unmarried. They are a hard people. They don't understand." He looked at them both, his eyes kind but clear. "When?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Will this home be blessed?" The question hung in the air. "When will you marry? When will you make this proper?" Mara's breath caught. She had not let herself think that far. She was here. They were together, but she had no name for what they were. She looked down at her hands, suddenly uncertain. She felt a movement. She looked up. Calder was looking at her, his expression steady, unblinking. He had not flinched at the Reverend's question. He had not looked away. He simply watched her, his eyes asking a question of his own. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached across the small table. He didn't offer a ring. He didn't make a grand gesture. He simply laid his large, calloused, charcoal-stained hand over hers, where it rested on the table. His thumb stroked the back of her hand. Once. It was an answer. It was a choice. It was a public declaration, made in silence, more powerful than any vow spoken before a crowd. "We are this. She is mine. I am hers. We have chosen." Mara turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. She looked back at the Reverend, her spine straight. Reverend Marin watched the silent exchange. He saw the man's steadfastness and the woman's strength. He saw the child who was smiling at their joined hands. A slow, wise smile spread across his own face. He nodded, as if a question had been answered to his complete satisfaction. "Yes," he said, as if in agreement. "I see." He pushed his chair back and stood, placing his empty mug on the table. "The Lord," he said, his voice soft but firm, "looks at the works you do, not just the words you say." He placed his hat back on his head. "God bless this house. Mara, Calder, young Wren. He left. Mara and Calder stood at the door, their hands still joined, and watched him ride away until he was a small, dark speck against the horizon. That evening, Wren, who had been given a small piece of the red ribbon from the peddler's wagon, stood on a stool by the door. She reached up and tied the bright, crimson bow onto the old, rusty horseshoe that hung above the doorway. "What's that for, little bird?" Mara asked, coming up behind her. "For luck," Wren said seriously. "To keep the wind out, and to make the house happy." Later, when the cabin was filled with the warm, flickering light of the hearth and Wren was fast asleep, Mara sat at the table, her storybook open. Calder sat opposite her, the slate in his lap. He was practicing. Mara wrote a word in her clear script. "Thank you." Calder copied it, his hand, more used to an axe handle, forming the letters with slow, laborious care. Mara wrote another, "Stay." He copied it. Then she wrote the last one, "Us." He looked at the word for a long time, then, very carefully, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He drew the letters, U-S. He looked up at her, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded, her heart so full she thought it might break. The fire crackled, a warm, contented sound. Outside, the wind still blew, as it always would, but it seemed to have lost its sharp, biting edge. It no longer sounded like a threat, but like a whisper, a song passing over a house that was safe and strong, and for the first time in 3 long years, the sound of quiet. Shared laughter echoed from the walls of Mesquite Gate Ranch. The new, fragile piece of the ranch was a living thing. A garden Mara tended with the same care as her kitchen herbs, but the past was not a weed that could be pulled and discarded. Its roots ran deep beneath the soil, and they were beginning to stir. The first tremor came, as it often did, from Ephra Thatch. He had stopped by to inspect Calder's mending shoulder, and he and Mara sat on the porch, watching Wren draw pictures in the dirt. "That pike," Ephra mused, his eyes on the distant line of the hollow. "The youngest of that red-hand bunch. He's got a mean streak, but he's a coward at heart, the worst kind. You know, he worked at the post office for a spell last year. Got himself fired. Mr. Abernathy, the postmaster, is a stickler. Said Pike was too careless with the correspondence, but my guess is he was just plain sticky-fingered." Mara went very still. The original letter, the one that had summoned her here, was tucked away in her small wooden trunk. She had kept it as a reminder, a scar. Did he have access to everything?" Mara asked, her voice quiet. "Oh, heavens, yes," Ephra rattled. "For 6 months. He was the only one in there sides Abernathy. Had the run of the place. Ink, paper, all them official-looking stamps and seals. A man with a key to the post office is a man with a key to a lot of secrets." The seed was planted. It festered, an itch in her mind that she couldn't ignore. A few days later, she rode into Sagebrush Hollow, telling Calder she needed to buy thread and salt. Tucked in her pocket, folded small, was the letter. The post office was a cramped, dusty room at the front of the general store. Mr. Abernathy, a small man with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers, peered at her over his spectacles. "Help you, ma'am." "I'd like to buy a stamp, please," Mara said, her heart hammering. "And do you have a public pen? I just need to address this." She held up a blank envelope she'd brought. "Right there," he grunted, pointing to a small, messy desk in the corner. It was exactly as she had hoped. A cheap wooden pen sat in a heavy glass inkwell, the black ink thick and filmy. A large, stained blotter lay beside it. She picked up the pen, dipped it, and let a large drop of ink fall onto her scrap paper. Then, as if by accident, she knocked the inkwell, just slightly. A small, irregular puddle of ink spilled onto the blotter. "Oh, clumsy me," she breathed, dabbing at it with her own handkerchief. "Mr. Abernathy just grunted, annoyed. But Mara had seen what she needed to see. The ink, as it soaked into the porous paper of the blotter, spread in a peculiar way, a dark center with a faint, feathery, almost bluish-gray ring around the edge. It was distinctive. That night, by the fire, she took out the original letter. She unfolded it, her hand steady, and there, at the bottom, just after the signature of Calder Boone, was a small, identical blot, a dark center with a feathery, bluish-gray ring. It was the ink from the post office well, the well Pike had access to. The next thread led her to a place she never thought she would go, the Silver Spur Saloon. She went in the morning, when the place smelled only of stale beer and sawdust, not of men in trouble. She carried a basket of eggs and a small wheel of cheese she had pressed herself. Delilah Voss was behind the bar, polishing glasses. She was a woman in her 40s, with hair the color of a new copper penny and eyes that had seen everything and forgiven very little. She looked Mara up and down, taking in the clean but patched dress, the determined set of her jaw. "We don't get many ladies in here," Delilah said, her voice smooth but with a sharp edge. "And not for breakfast." "I'm not here for breakfast," Mara said, placing her basket on the bar. "I'm here to sell. Ephra Thatch said you buy fresh." Delilah inspected the eggs, her gaze shrewd. "He was right. I'll take them." As she counted out the coins, Mara spoke, her voice low. "I'm not just here to sell, Mrs. Voss. I'm the woman who came to Mesquite Gate Ranch, the mail-order bride." Delilah's hand stilled on the coins. Her sharp eyes met Mara's. "I know who you are." "You hear a lot in this room," Mara said, not as a question, but as a fact. "A few months back, did you ever hear Cole's writers bragging about a letter about a joke?" Delilah looked at her for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a short, hard laugh. "Bragging girl. They were swimming in cheap whiskey and couldn't stop bragging. Thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever done. A bride for the mute man." Cole was shouting it to the rafters. "Bet she'll be real disappointed when he don't whisper sweet nothings." "That bunch," she said, her voice dropping into a snarl of contempt. "They're poison, rotten from the inside out, just like their fathers." "Who was with him?" "The usual lackeys, Brant, Ames, and that shaky-handed Jory, scribbling on a napkin. Pike was there too, laughing so hard he spilled beer all over the floor. Said he'd made it look real and official." "Why you looking to make trouble?" "I'm looking for the truth," Mara said. She gathered her coins. "Thank you for the eggs." "You be careful, girl," Delilah called after her as she reached the door. "Truth's a dangerous thing in this town, and those boys don't play by any rules." Her next stop was Reverend Silas. She found him tending the small, dusty graveyard behind his church. He looked up, his face grim, as if he knew why she was there. "Reverend," she said, "I have to ask you something. That letter, it wasn't just the boys, was it?" Silas sighed, a long, weary sound. He leaned on his shovel. "Mara, some things are best left buried." "Not this," she said, her voice firm. "They attacked Calder. They threw a bottle. This isn't a prank anymore. This is a sickness, and it's being protected." The Reverend's gaze fell. "You are a perceptive woman," he said sadly. "No, it wasn't just the boys. I was at a dinner at the home of Cole's father, Mr. Harrison. He's the richest man in this county. He was laughing." The Reverend looked ill. "He was telling the other ranchers about a bit of sport his boy was having. He said, Cole's stirring up the mute man, sending him a mail-order wife. Ought to be a good show." They all laughed. Mara, they laughed. And they called for more brandy. "So they knew," Mara whispered. the cold fury rising in her. They all knew. They thought it was a harmless joke, Silas said. Something to break the monotony. They are powerful men, and they are careless with their power. They don't see the harm in their sport. It has gone too far. Mara, far, far too far. She had one more piece to find. She went to the sheriff's office, a small log building with a single, barred cell that was almost always empty. Deputy Rowan Hale was at the desk, his head bent over a stack of paperwork. He was a quiet, pensive man, not much older than Mara, with a reputation for being thorough and, more importantly, fair. He was not related to any of the powerful families. "Deputy Hale," she said. He looked up, his eyes a clear, steady gray. "Ma'am, what can I do for you?" She laid the letter on his desk. "I need you to look at this handwriting. I need to know whose it is." He didn't ask her where she got it. He didn't ask her why. He simply picked it up and studied it, his brow furrowed. He looked at the strong, looping B and Boone, the confident, masculine script. He pulled open a drawer and took out a file. He shuffled through it, finally pulling out a bill of sale for a horse, dated 2 years prior. He laid the two documents side by side. He looked at them for a full minute, comparing the slant, the way the T was crossed, the way the O was formed. Then he pulled out a magnifying glass and peered closer, first at one, then the other. "Well," he said, sitting back, "the man who signed this bill of sale is Jory Kincaid." He tapped the letter. "And the man who wrote this," he said, his voice flat and certain, "is also Jory Kincaid. The hand is identical. Where did you get this?" "Mrs. Linden." "It was sent to me in St. Louis. It's why I came here." Rowan Hale's face hardened. He understood. He looked at the signature. Calder Boone. He knew Calder couldn't write, let alone speak. This is a federal offense. Ma'am impersonating another, misusing the U.S. mail." "I know," Mara said. "Thank you, Deputy." She walked back to the wagon, her mind a cold, clear engine. She had it all. Pike at the post office, with access to the ink and the seal. Jory, with his practiced hand, writing the letter. Cole, Brandt, and Ames, the core of the group, and all of them bragging about it, fueled by Delilah's whiskey and protected by their father's power and laughter. This was not blind revenge. This was not a desire to see them hang. It was a cold, precise need for justice. The memory of Ayanna in the bell tower, the feel of Calder's blood on her hands, the sound of Wren crying in the bedroom. These things demanded an answer. Not in fire, but in law. But the Red Hand riders were not ones to be hunted. They were the hunters. Perhaps they sensed the shift in her, the new hardness in her gaze when she passed them in town. Perhaps Delilah had let a word slip, or perhaps their cruelty was simply bored again. The escalation began. Calder found the north fence cut clean through. A dozen head of his cattle wandered off into the brush. It took him 2 days to find them. Then, a few nights later, they woke to a sound that was not the wind, a scraping, splashing sound. Calder was out the door in an instant, his rifle in hand. Mara was right behind him, the shotgun in hers, but they were gone. All that was left was the message, gleaming wetly in the moonlight on their front gate. A crude, dripping handprint, painted in red, the sign of the riders. It was a threat. It was a brand. "This is ours. You are not welcome. We can touch you whenever we want." That night, there was no pretense of sleep. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low. Mara looked at Calder, at the lines of exhaustion and fury around his mouth. "They want us to be afraid. Calder, they want us to run." He shook his head. A single, sharp motion. He would not run. "Then we fight," she said, "but not their way, not in the dark." Their preparations were twofold. Calder, the man of the land, fortified the ranch. He was a shadow in the moonlight. his shoulder now strong enough for the work. He strung a thin wire around the perimeter of the house and barn, just a few inches off the ground. From it, he hung dozens of empty tin cans and a few small brass bells. It was a crude alarm, but it would wake them. He moved lanterns to new positions, setting them in windows in the barn and the shed, creating an illusion of more men, of more watchers than just one. Mara, the woman of words, prepared for a different kind of battle. She sat at the table and she wrote. She wrote down everything. She wrote about the letter, the date it arrived, the lie it contained. She wrote about the jeers of the riders on her first day. She wrote down Ephra's entire, horrific story about Ayanna and Calder's throat. She wrote about the ink blot, and Delilah's testimony, and Reverend Silas's shame-faced confession. She wrote about Deputy Hale's identification of Jory's hand. She wrote about the cut fence and the painted red hand. She wrote it all down in her clear, precise script, a cold, factual accounting of a long reign of casual terror. She made 2 copies, her hand cramping. The next day, she wrote out. She gave 1 copy to Ephra, who sealed it in a tin box. "They'll have to kill me to get it," he vowed. She gave the other to Reverend Silas, who locked it in the church safe behind the communion silver. "God forgive them," he whispered, his hands shaking. "And God protect you." That night, the wind howled, rattling the tin cans on their new alarm wire. A constant, jangling symphony of their vigilance. Wren, now accustomed to the house's sounds, slept soundly through it. Mara tucked the blanket around her daughter's chin. "Is the wind angry, Mama?" Wren mumbled in her sleep. Mara smoothed her hair. "No, sweetheart, the wind is just strong." She kissed her forehead. "Our family is brave," she whispered, "but we are not reckless. Go to sleep." The chance came a week later. At the Saturday market, the small square of Sagebrush Hollow was crowded with ranchers, farmers, and townsfolk. Mara was selling her cheese and eggs at a small stall. She was watching, as she always did now. Her gaze was Annette, scanning the crowd. She saw the mail courier, a young man on a tired horse, pull up in front of the post office. He dismounted, his mail bag heavy on his shoulder. And she saw Pike. He was leaning against a post, pretending to whittle a stick. He accidentally bumped into the courier, a clumsy, apologetic shove. "Sorry there, friend." In that brief, manufactured collision, Mara's eyes, now sharp and practiced, saw Pike's hand dip into the open mailbag and emerge with a small handful of letters. It was deft, quick, and utterly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The courier, cursing under his breath, went inside. Pike, whistling, ambled away. Mara left her stall, whispering to her neighbor to watch it. She followed him. She kept her distance, using the crowd as cover. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go to his father's bank. He cut down a back alley, heading toward the abandoned part of town, where a few old buildings were rotting back into the earth. He slipped into an old, derelict granary, the door groaning on its hinges. Mara waited. Her heart was a cold, hard drum. She counted to 100. Then she moved. She crept to the side of the building, where a high, dusty window was missing a pane of glass. She pulled an empty crate over and stood on it, peering into the gloom. She saw him. He was at a small, makeshift table, and on the table, she saw it all. She saw the letters he had just stolen. She saw a dozen other letters, some opened, some not. She saw a small, carved wooden box, and sitting next to it, gleaming dully in the shaft of light, was a heavy, brass object. It was the official post office seal, the one used to emboss the wax on official correspondence. It all clicked into place with a sickening, cold clarity. This wasn't just a prank. This wasn't just about her, or even about Calder. They had been doing this for months, stealing mail, opening letters. Perhaps they were looking for money, or just for secrets, for more sport. The letter to her, it had been a whim, an amusement, using the tools they had already stolen, the power they already wielded with such careless, entitled arrogance. This was not a prank that had gone too far. This was a pattern of casual, criminal power, wielded by a group of rich men's sons who believed the world, and everyone in it, was their personal plaything. The night was thin, worn down to a sliver. A waning moon offered just enough cold, ghostly light to turn the ranch into a landscape of stark, silver-gray highlights and deep, formless shadows. It was a predator's moon, a moon for secrets. Inside the cabin, the embers in the hearth were a dull, fading red, offering little warmth against the chill that crept in. The first sound was not the wind. It was a sharp, metallic jangle, followed by a series of smaller tinks. It was unnatural, a violation of the night's rhythm, the tin cans on the wire. Calder was on his feet before the sound had fully died, moving with a speed and silence that was startling. He was not a man waking from sleep. He was a man who had simply been waiting. In the moon-drenched shadows of the room, he was already a silhouette, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. Mara was awake an instant later, her heart leaping from a dead sleep into a frantic, hammering rhythm. She saw Calder's shape, and she knew. They were here. He didn't look at her. He made one sharp, downward gesture with his free hand. The root cellar. It was their plan. Mara slid from the cot, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. She moved to Wren's small bed. The child was stirring, her breathing hitched, sensing the new, sharp tension in the air. "Mama," she whimpered. "It's a game, sweetheart," Mara whispered, her voice miraculously calm, a smooth stone of reassurance in the dark. She scooped the warm, sleepy child into her arms. "A new game. It's called Quiet as a Mouse. We're going to hide in the pantry, and you must not make a sound, not one single sound until I come and get you. Can you do that for me?" Wren, trusting and confused, nodded against her neck, her small hands clutching Mara's nightgown. Mara carried her to the thick, heavy planked door of the root cellar, set into the floor of the pantry. She eased it open, revealing a square of absolute blackness that smelled of damp earth, potatoes, and safety. She climbed down the 3 short steps and settled Wren on a clean burlap sack. "You are safe here, my love. Be the quietest mouse in the whole world." She kissed Wren's forehead, climbed out, and lowered the heavy door, settling it into its frame with a soft, final thud. When she turned back, the cabin was a fortress. Calder was by the window, a dark shape peering through a crack in the curtain. Mara moved to the front door, her hands checking the heavy wooden bar she had insisted they install. It was solid. She went to the back door. Its bar was also in place. She then went to the hearth and took down the shotgun. The metal was cold, but the weight was familiar now, almost a comfort. She checked the load. Both barrels. A low, drunken laugh cut through the night, followed by the stamp of horses. They were at the barn. "They're going for the barn! Boone!" It was Cole's voice, loud and full of arrogant spite. "Let's give your new wife a housewarming, a bright one." A sudden, violent whoosh lit up the yard. Mara saw it through the window, a terrible, leaping column of orange flame. They hadn't set the barn itself on fire, but the massive, dry haystack piled just beside it. The wind was blowing toward the barn. Sparks were already catching on the dry shingles of the roof. Calder was out the back door before she could even cry out. He had planned for this. He grabbed the massive, heavy canvas tarp he had left soaking in the water trough. It was a colossal, dripping weight, but he hauled it, running low, his shoulder healed and strong. He used the wind, letting it help him, and with a grunt of immense effort, he threw the wet canvas. It sailed up and over, smothering the heart of the haystack fire. The flames hissed and sputtered, fighting back, but the wet, heavy blanket was choking them. At the same time, another, smaller torch landed on their porch, skittering against the logs. It was meant to drive them out. Mara didn't hesitate. Beside the door, She had her own defense ready, a wooden bucket filled with a slurry of water, lye, and saleratus, a simple, foaming chemical mix. She threw open the door, tossed the entire contents of the bucket onto the burning torch and the boards. There was a violent, acrid hiss as the lye foam hit the flames, and the fire on the porch was extinguished in a cloud of stinging, chemical-scented steam. The riders howled in fury. This was not the response they had expected. They had expected screaming, panic, a man and a woman trapped. They had not expected a coordinated, immediate defense. Pike, enraged and drunk on his own malice, acted on impulse. "I'll get him out," he roared, and he charged the porch, a dark, fast-moving shape. His hand raised. Mara was standing in the open doorway, the shotgun held level at her waist. She didn't raise it to her shoulder. She just stood, a solid, unmoving shadow in the frame, blocking his path. "The line is here," she said. Her voice was not a scream. It was a low, guttural vibration, as cold and final as a eulogy. Pike stopped dead. He had been charging a cowering victim. He had run straight into a wall of iron. He stood 3 feet from her, breathing hard, his small, vicious eyes wide. In the light of the smoking, smothered hay bale, he could see the twin black holes of the shotgun barrels, pointed directly at his stomach. "I said," Mara repeated. "The line is here." "She's right, son." The voice came from the darkness, deep and steady. A figure stepped out from the shadow of the barn. Deputy Rowan Hale, his rifle held easily in his hands, its muzzle pointed at no one in particular, but ready. Pike whimpered, a small, animal sound. He was trapped. And then the light changed. Another figure emerged from the side of the house, holding a lantern high. Reverend Silas Marin, his face not that of a gentle shepherd, but of a wrathful Old Testament judge. His light illuminated the entire yard, catching the riders in a frozen, guilty tableau. "You're a little late for the party, Pike," a third voice rattled. Ephra Thatch stepped out, his old rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "Or maybe we're just early." Cole and the others, sitting on their horses, were stunned, their faces pale and slack-jawed in the sudden lantern light. They were surrounded. "How?" Cole stammered. Mara looked past him, to the low ridge behind the ranch. There, just visible, was the smoking remains of a small, contained fire, her signal, the moment the first bell had jingled, while Calder went for his rifle. She had lit the small pile of oil-soaked rags she had hidden there 2 days before. It wasn't just a defense. It had been an invitation. Pike, his cowardice turning to cornered animal panic, made his last, stupid move. He wouldn't be taken. He let out a yell and drew a long, gleaming Bowie knife from his boot, lunging not at Rowan, but at Mara. He never had a chance. Rowan moved, not with anger, but with a brutal efficiency. He didn't shoot. He slammed the butt of his rifle sideways, a short, hard jab that connected with Pike's wrist. A sickening, wet crack echoed in the yard. The knife clattered harmlessly onto the porch boards. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound, clutching his shattered arm. Rowan grabbed him, spun him around, and forced the one good arm behind his back in a painful lock. "Get your hands off him," Cole shouted, his authority returning. He started to dismount, to come to his friend's aid. "It was just a joke. We were just—" "It stopped being a joke. Cole—" The voice was new, deep, and laced with a cold, terrifying fury. A big man on a fine-looking bay horse rode into the lantern light. He was followed by 2 other ranchers. It was Mr. Harrison, Cole's father, the wealthiest and most powerful man in the county. His face was granite. "I got a message from the Reverend," Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. His eyes locked on his son. "He said you might be out here, dishonoring my name." I see he was right. As Rowan hauled the whimpering Pike toward the porch steps, his coat, which had been open, snagged on the railing. Something heavy fell from his inner pocket. It hit the wooden porch with a solid, metallic thud. Reverend Silas moved his lantern closer. The light gleamed on the object. It was heavy, circular, and made of brass. It was the official seal of the United States Post Office. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the newcomers. Mr. Abernathy, the postmaster, pushed his way through the small crowd, his eyes wide with horror. That's my seal! He stole my seal! Mr. Harrison's face, which had been angry, went utterly, sickeningly pale. His son's joke hazing a mute man. Scaring a woman was one thing. He could have fixed that. He could have paid for the hay, smoothed it over. But this was a federal crime. This was theft of the U.S. mail. This was prison. This was a scandal that could ruin his entire family, his entire empire. "Cole," Harrison whispered. His voice choked. What have you done?" "I told you they were trash." A new voice, sharp and laced with bourbon, joined the chorus. Delilah Voss pushed her way to the front, carrying a massive, old flintlock musket, the kind that had been old at the Alamo. She strode right past Mr. Harrison and stood on the step below Mara, a self-appointed guard. She glowered at the stunned, silent riders. "I've watched you worthless pups brag and strut in my saloon for the last time. I've listened to you toast your own cruelty long enough." She patted the musket. "Thought I'd finally come see what all the fuss was about." The fire in the haystack was out, reduced to a smoking, steaming ruin. There had been no gunfight, no bloodshed, save for a coward's broken wrist. The evidence was bright and damning on the porch. The witnesses were all there, the law, the church, the town's elders, and the town's cynical, moral heart. The balance of power, held for so long by a few rich, careless families, had just irrevocably shifted in the dirt of the Mesquite Gate ranch yard. Rowan Hale, all business, pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Pike Matthews, you're under arrest for theft of government property, interfering with the U.S. mail, and attempted arson." He pulled a second pair out. "Jory Kincaid," he said, pointing to the man who had forged the letter. "You're under arrest for conspiracy and fraud." But... Cole was sputtering now, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked to his father for help, but found none. It was just a joke. It was just a joke. Reverend Silas stepped forward, his shadow, cast by the lantern he held, looming over them all. His voice was not soft, and it was not forgiving. "Humiliation is not a joke. Cole, malice is not sport. What you and your friends did to Ayanna Boone was a sin that cries out from the earth. What you did to this family was a crime, and you will answer for it, if not to God, then to the law." In the center of this new, quiet circle, Mara's hands, no longer holding the shotgun, began to shake. The adrenaline was draining, leaving her cold and trembling. A warm, solid hand found hers in the dark, called her. He stepped to her side, his presence a silent, unshakable anchor. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the men who had tormented him, his face calm, his gaze steady. His calloused palm enveloped hers, a simple, powerful promise that needed no words. "We are safe. We are whole." A soft creak came from the floorboards inside. The root cellar door. Mara's heart lurched. She let go of Calder's hand and turned. A small head, haloed in tangled brown hair, peeked out of the pantry. Wren's eyes were wide, taking in the crowd, the lanterns, the men on horses. "Mama." Her voice was a tiny, frightened whisper. Mara rushed to her, kneeling on the floor and sweeping her up into a fierce embrace. Wren buried her face in Mara's neck, her small body trembling. "It was a loud game, Mama." "It's over, baby," Mara whispered, her voice thick, kissing her head. "The game is over." She stood up, holding Wren tight to her chest, and walked out onto the porch. She stood there, her child in her arms, her man at her side. She looked at the smoldering remains of the hay, at the faces of the men who had tried to drive them out, and at the scorched but standing porch beneath her feet. The house had held. The roof was not trembling. They were home. The trial, if it could be called that, was not held in a courthouse. There was none. It was a field trial, convened by the county council, a collection of ranchers, the postmaster, and the doctor on the wide, covered porch of the general store. It was, in essence, the entire town of Sagebrush Hollow putting its own sickness on display in the harsh, unflinching light of day. Pike, his arm in a crude sling, and Jory, who seemed to be vibrating with a palsied terror, stood before them, flanked by Deputy Rowan Hale. Cole was there, too, not accused, but implicated, standing near his father, Mr. Harrison looked ill, his face the color of old parchment. Rowan Hale did not speak with passion. He spoke with facts. He laid the items on a barrelhead for the council to see. First, the letter, with Jory's looping, practice script. Second, the bill of sale for a horse, signed by Jory, the handwriting identical. And third, the heavy brass seal of the United States Post Office, which he placed down with a thud that echoed the finality of a gavel. "This," Rowan said, his voice quiet but carrying, "is a federal crime, conspiracy to defraud, impersonation, and theft of government property. The penalty for tampering with the UMS mail is severe. It is not sport." Mr. Harrison, Cole's father, stepped forward, his voice a low, reasonable rumble. He was a man used to solving problems. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the council, "not the deputy. These are boys, foolish, idiotic boys. They've learned their lesson. That is, no serious harm was done that can't be mended. The haystack. I'll pay for it, double, and for Mr. Boone's trouble, a compensation. Say, 50 head of my best cattle." It was the old way, the way of power, money and beef, smoothing over all disruptions. But Rowan Hale shook his head. "This ain't a matter of cattle. Mr. Harrison, this is a federal matter. The seal was taken. The mail was stolen. The letter was a fraud. It's out of my hands, and it's out of yours. It's a matter for the territorial marshal. Unless this council decides on a punishment so fitting that the marshal, when he hears of it, will deem the matter settled." He let the threat hang in the air. A federal trial meant ruin, not just for the boys, but for the families, the bank, the whole county. Then the witnesses spoke. Ephra Thatch, his voice a dry rattle, spoke first. He did not speak of the letter. He spoke of a night 3 years prior, of a bell tower, and of a man left to bleed in the dirt. He provided the context for the cruelty, painting the letter not as a prank, but as the continuation of a long, vicious campaign. Delilah Voss went next. She spoke of the night of bragging, her arms crossed, her eyes daring anyone to challenge her. "I heard him," she said, her voice sharp. "Cole, bragging his head off. Jory, practicing the signature. And Pike, laughing about how he'd make it look official. They were toasting a bride for the mute man. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was malice, plain and simple, served with my cheapest whiskey." Then Mara stood. Calder was beside her, his hand at the small of her back, a silent, steadying pressure. He was her anchor. Every eye in the square was on her. She was not the trembling, humiliated woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. She was not the mail-order bride. She was the mistress of Mesquite Gate. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. Her words were as clean and sharp as new nails. "I was in St. Louis," she began, her voice clear in the silence. "I had nothing. I received this letter." She pointed to the barrelhead, promising safety, promising a home for a child who needed one. "I spent every cent I had to come here." She looked at Cole, then at his father. "When I arrived, your sons were on the ridge. Laughing, they called me a name I will not repeat. They laughed at Mr. Boone's wound, a wound they had a hand in giving him. Her gaze swept the crowd, the silent, watching faces of the town. I was a fool, a prop in their sport. I was humiliated and I was stranded. I had nowhere to go. I turned to leave. She paused, and her voice softened, just slightly. And Mr. Boone, the man they mocked, he saw I had nowhere to go. He couldn't speak, but he wrote on a slate. He offered me a job. He offered me the safety his name had falsely promised. And when I was cold, he took off his own coat, and he put it on my shoulders. She let the simple, decent act hang in the air, a stark contrast to the casual cruelty of the young men before them. "This," she said, her voice hardening again, "was not a joke. It was an act of cruelty, designed to harm a good man and to destroy a woman who had nothing left. It failed. I am still here." She sat down. The silence was absolute. The council did not deliberate for long. The verdict was delivered. Jory and Pike were found guilty. Cole, by virtue of his father's name and the lack of hard proof, was spared arrest, but not punishment. The sentence was this restitution, in full, for the hay and the cut fence, to be paid not by their fathers, but from their own allowances or by selling their prized horses. Second, 100 hours of hard community labor, to be overseen by Deputy Hale, starting with rebuilding the mesquite gate fence and splitting all of Calder's wood for the winter. And third, a public apology, to be delivered in the chapel the following Sunday, to Calder Boone and Mara Linden, in front of the entire congregation. That Sunday, the chapel was so full that people stood in the doorway. Pike, his arm in a clean sling, and Jory, his face ashen, stood before the pulpit. Cole was forced to stand with them, his father's hand on his shoulder, his face burning with a silent, sullen fury. Reverend Silas did not spare them. "You will repeat after me," he commanded, his voice filling the small church. We, Jory stammered. "We," the Reverend repeated, louder. "We," they mumbled, all three of them. "Admit that we acted with malice and cruelty. Admit we acted with malice and cruelty. We publicly apologize to Calder Boone for the years of torment, for the attack on his home, and for the slander against his name. We publicly apologize to Calder Boone." Cole's voice was barely a whisper, choked with a shame that was, as the outline suggested, a medicine more bitter than any herb. "And we publicly apologize to Mara Linden," the Reverend continued, his eyes finding hers in the front pew, "for the fraud, the humiliation, and the terror we caused her. We publicly apologize to Mara Linden." They said the words. They were just words. But in this place, in front of these people, they were a judgment. The power of the Red Hand Riders was broken, not by a gun, but by the weight of their own community's gaze. Things changed after that. It was slow, like the turning of a season. The crude, red handprints that had been painted on gates and water troughs as warnings were scrubbed away, not by the victims, but by the townspeople. The money from the restitution was delivered to Mara by Deputy Hale. She took it, went to Delilah Voss, and started a new account at the bank. "It's not my money," she said. "It's the town's—" They called it the Independent Women's Fund, a small coffer, managed by Delilah and Mara, to help any woman who arrived in Sagebrush Hollow stranded, or in need of a new start, just as she had been. That next Saturday, Delilah found her in the market. "You know," Delilah said, "you tell a good story. That bit about the coat. It had half the men in that square looking at their own boots in shame." She grinned. "You should come by the saloon tonight, just for an hour. Tell some of those stories you're writing down. I'll make 'em behave." "You think they'd listen?" Mara asked. "Men will be quiet and listen to almost anything," Delilah said. "If they think their hearts are decent, and they get to look at a strong woman while they do it, don't let 'em down. The public battle was over. The private one was settled that night. The air was cool, smelling of pine dust and the first hint of winter. The stars were sharp, bright chips in the black. Mara was on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the crickets, when Calder came and sat beside her. He was silent for a long time. She was used to his silence. It was a comfortable, shared space now. But this was a different quiet. It was full, expectant. He held out his hand. In his calloused, scarred palm was a small, crudely carved wooden box. It looked like he had whittled it himself from a piece of cottonwood. She took it. It was warm from his hand. "What is this?" He just nodded, encouraging her to open it. She lifted the simple lid. Inside, on a bed of soft rabbit fur, were 2 items. The first was a length of faded, pale blue ribbon, the one she had worn in her hair the day she arrived. She hadn't even known it was missing. He had kept it, a secret token. Beside it was a ring. It was not gold or jeweled. It was silver, simple and heavy, bent into a circle, the ends imperfectly joined. It looked like it had been hammered and shaped by a strong, unsteady hand. It was beautiful. She picked it up and saw a single, crudely scratched word on the inside. "We." Her breath caught. She looked up at him, her eyes stinging. He was watching her, his face taut with a vulnerability she had never seen, not even when he was wounded. He opened his mouth. He was going to speak. She saw the effort in his throat, the tightening of the scar. He forced the words, the air rasping over the damaged chords. "Mara." It was a breath, a piece of his soul. "Stay." He fought for the next word, his hand clenching at his side. "Am with life?" It was the most beautiful question she had ever heard. "Oh, Kung, do I stay with life? My life? Our life?" She couldn't speak. She just put the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. Then she leaned in, put her hands on his rough, unshaven cheeks, and pressed her forehead against his. Tears, not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful, streamed down her face, wetting his skin. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." A small sound came from the doorway. They turned. Wren was standing there in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes, her burlap doll clutched in her hand. She was beaming. "Good," Wren announced, clapping her hands softly. "Our family keeps each other." Calder's good arm wrapped around Mara's waist, pulling her tight. His other hand found Wren's, and he tugged her into the embrace. There, on the dark porch, under a ceiling of cold, distant stars. They chose each other. They didn't need a church, or a license, or the blessing of the town. They had already been tried by fire, and they had endured. They were a family, forged in the quiet, in the smell of pine, and in the sound of crickets singing their approval. Winter came not as a storm, but as a slow, quiet surrender. One morning they awoke to a world hushed and white, a thin blanket of snow clinging to the fence posts and softening the hard edges of the land. The air was clean and sharp, and the silence was absolute. From the porch, Calder watched them. Wren, squealing with a joy so pure it was almost a sound you could see, was a small, bright figure in a red wool scarf, tossing handfuls of the white powder into the air. And Mara stood near her, her head tilted, a small, private smile on her face as she watched the child play. The weak winter sun caught in her hair, turning it to a halo of dark fire against the snow. And in that moment, looking at the two of them, a thought, whole and certain, formed in Calder's mind. My girls. He had a wife. He had a daughter. He had 2. Later, while Wren was napping, a deep, quiet mood settled over Mara. She found herself drawn to her old wooden trunk, the one that held the few possessions she'd brought with her from St. Louis. She opened it, the familiar scent of lavender and old paper rising to meet her. There, folded neatly on top, was the canvas work coat, Calder's coat, the one he had placed on her shoulders that first day. She had washed it since then, scrubbed the grime from the cuffs and mended a tear near the pocket with her small, even stitches. It was no longer just his. It was part of their story. As she lifted it, a small slip of paper fluttered out from a fold and landed on the floor. It was his handwriting, the square, heavy script she now knew as well as her own, but it was unsteady, as if written with great effort or great emotion. That day, the note read, "My heart chose you." She sank down onto the edge of the cot, the coat in her lap, the note in her hand. That day, not the night by the fire, not the day she stood against the riders, the very first day, when she was a stranger, humiliated and lost, with nothing to offer but her own desperation. Even then, in the midst of the cruelty and the shame, his heart had made a choice. The coat had not just been a kindness, it had been a promise. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. It was too big, the shoulders wide, the cuffs falling over her hands, but it was warm, and it smelled of him, of wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap she used. She walked out onto the porch, pulling the collar tight around her neck. He was there, leaning against a post, watching the snow. He heard her and turned. He didn't speak, but his eyes took in the sight of her, swallowed in his old coat, and a soft, gentle light came into them. He reached out and laid his hand on her shoulder, a familiar gesture that still, always, sent a small, warm tremor through her. They stood together, side by side, their shoulders touching. They watched Wren, who had woken from her nap and was now lying on her back, waving her arms and legs to create the lopsided, joyful shape of a snow angel. The peace between them was no longer a fragile, new thing. It was solid. It was the ground beneath their feet. That night, after Wren was asleep, the fire in the hearth burned low and steady, a warm, beating heart in the center of the cabin. The world outside was silent and frozen, but inside, a profound warmth was building. It was in the way Calder watched her as she moved, in the way she anticipated his need for more coffee before he could even think to ask. He was on the bearskin rug, tending the fire. She came and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat from his body. He looked at her, his face serious in the firelight, and the question was there in his eyes, clear and direct. It was a question about more than just the night. It was about the rest of their nights. She gave him a slow, certain nod. Her answer. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He kissed her, and it was different from before. It was a kiss of quiet, solemn promise. His lips met hers with a certainty, a knowledge of the landscape of her mouth, just as she knew his. The rough stubble of his beard was a familiar, welcome texture against her skin. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers in the flickering light. He eased the heavy wool shawl from her shoulders, his movements slow and deliberate. A ceremony. The opening of the shawl was like the opening of a door. He unfastened the buttons of her dress, his hand steady this time, his gaze never leaving hers. He lifted her then, his arms strong and sure, and laid her down on the thick, soft fur of the rug. He lay beside her, propped on one elbow, his body a warm, protective line against the cool air. He looked down at her, his expression one of awe, as if he were seeing a miracle. He whispered, his voice a low, rough rasp, a sound meant only for her. "You, okay?" "Yes," she breathed, her voice full of a trust so complete it was a prayer. Their coming together was a continuation of that prayer. It was a series of solemn, reverent touches. His hand, calloused and strong, traced the line of her spine. A slow, deliberate exploration that was not about passion, but about learning and possession in the gentlest sense of the word. Her fingers mapped the hard muscle of his back, the sharp line of his shoulder blades. They would kiss, then pull apart just to smile at each other in the dim, red glow of the embers. Their breath mingled, a shared offering in the quiet room. It was profoundly intimate, warm and deep and utterly private, a secret kept safe by the log walls and the sleeping winter night. The next morning, Wren was the first one awake. She let out a small gasp of delight. Mara and Calder, stirring from a shared sleep under a pile of quilts, followed her gaze. On the main wall of the cabin, the one opposite the hearth, was a new drawing. It was large, done in charcoal, and it was Calder's best work yet. It was the three of them, a tall man, a woman with her hand in his, and a small child holding both their hands. They were standing under the familiar, wind-tilted cottonwood tree, and beneath it, in Calder's heavy, square script, were the words, "Makete Gate Home." It was a new portrait, a new family, a new truth, declared on the wall for the sun to see. The town continued its quiet atonement. Delilah Voss arrived one afternoon in her buggy, a long, newly painted plank of wood in the back. It was carved with deep, clear letters, no red hand. "Figured your gate needed a new sign," she said gruffly. "The whole town signed the back of it." And they had dozens of signatures, from Ephra's shaky scrawl to Deputy Hale's neat script, a silent, collective promise of protection. Ephra himself brought a gift, a new hammer, its head gleaming and oiled, its hickory handle smooth and strong. "For building," was all he said, and Reverend Silas came and placed a heavy, leather-bound Bible on their new bookshelf, a quiet blessing that settled the dust in the corners. One day, Mara looked out the window and saw a solitary figure at the far end of their property, where the fence had been cut. It was Cole Harrison. He was not on his fine horse. He was on foot, working with a post-hole digger, his movements stiff and angry. He was rebuilding the fence himself. As he finished, his father rode up. The two of them stood there for a moment, and then Mr. Harrison, the richest man in the county, turned his horse toward the house. He rode up to the porch where Mara was standing. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not arrogance or power, but a deep, weary shame. He removed his hat, a gesture of profound respect. He didn't speak. He just bowed his head, a long, slow inclination. It was a silent apology, years too late, but it was real. The wind still blew across the high plains, but it had changed. It no longer carried the scent of fear. It smelled of snowmelt and damp earth, the promise of a spring thaw. High overhead, a flock of crows wheeled and turned against the pale sky, their black wings seeming to trace new boundaries over the town, new lines of safety and respect. Calder was on the porch, getting ready to ride out and check on the cattle. He settled his hat on his head, a familiar, daily motion. Then he stopped. He looked at Mara, who was standing in the doorway. Slowly, he reached up and took the hat off again, holding it in his hands. It was his tell, the gesture he made when he had something large to say, something that came from a place deeper than words. He looked at her, and the guarded, watchful pain was gone from his eyes. In its place was a clarity, a freedom she had never seen before, like a frozen river finally breaking free in the March sun. A slow smile spread across Mara's face. "When you take off your hat like that," she said, her voice soft, "I know the next thing is always going to be tenderness." He didn't need to speak. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her into a deep, crushing embrace, right there in the doorway, the threshold where every new season of their life had begun. Here, in a place that had held tenderness in such low regard, in a land that answered insults with violence, they had built a fortress for it. They had built it out of a forged letter and a speaking scar. They had built it with a second-hand coat, a shared blanket, and a bookshelf marked with the handprint of a child. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm, contented sound. The love they had found in this dusty, windswept corner of the world was perhaps a small thing, but it was indomitable. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.